Welcome to your online learning content for National Truth and Reconciliation Day.
Hello, I'm pleased to have been involved in the following information share regarding truth and reconciliation in Canada. I'm thankful to our team for putting this information together, which is based on the various sources provided on each slide. It is important to me that we present information which is founded on these sources and not on biased opinions. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada provided 94 calls to action, with the 92nd one titled Business and Reconciliation, which calls on corporate Canada to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. By way of this information, we are supporting an element of that call to action. We are also looking to continue to operate with respectful relationships with our numerous partners to help build capacity both in Allnorth and in the communities we operate as another piece of the 92nd call to action. I hope you too enjoy this information and wish you a very good Truth and Reconciliation Day.
This learning content is designed to further our understanding of the purpose and importance of National Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada. Key areas covered include: what does truth and reconciliation mean? Acknowledging our shared history, and the path forward. The Truth and Reconciliation Report states that without truth, justice is not served, healing cannot happen, and there can be no genuine reconciliation between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Canada. Further, Elder Dave Corshane posed a critical question of the Commission. When you talk about truth, whose truth are you talking about? The Commission's answer to Elder Corshane's question is that by truth, we mean not only the truth revealed in government and church residential school documents, but also the truth of lived experiences as told to us by survivors and others in their statements to this Commission. Without truth, justice, and healing, there can be no genuine reconciliation. Reconciliation is not about closing a sad chapter of Canada's past, but about opening new healing pathways of reconciliation that are forged in truth and justice. Shaming and pointing out wrongdoing were not the purpose of the Commission's mandate. Ultimately, the Commission's focus on truth determination was intended to lay the foundation for the important question of reconciliation. Now that we know about residential schools and their legacy, what do we do about it? In order to understand the purpose of Truth and Reconciliation Day in Canada, it is important to understand the significance of September 30th. September 30th was chosen because that was the time of year the trucks and buses would enter the communities to collect the children and deliver them to their harsh new reality of the residential school system. It is recognized as Orange Shirt Day, a day where we honor the children of residential schools. Orange Shirt Day is a movement that officially began in 2013, but in reality, it began in 1973 when 6-year-old Phyllis Webstad entered the St. Joseph Mission Residential School outside of Williams Lake, BC. She was gifted a brand new orange shirt from her grandmother for her first day of school, but upon arrival, she was stripped of her new shirt and required to wear the school's institutional uniform, never to see the shirt again. Miss Webstad's story is the nucleus for what has become a national movement to recognize the experience of survivors of Indian residential schools, honor them, and show a collective commitment to ensure that every child matters. The initiative calls for every Canadian to wear an orange shirt on September 30th in the spirit of healing and reconciliation. As stated in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, until 1997, the Canadian government, in partnership with several Christian churches, operated a residential school system for Indigenous children. These government-funded, usually church-run schools and residences were set up to assimilate Indigenous people forcibly into the Canadian mainstream by eliminating parental and community involvement in the intellectual, cultural, and spiritual development of Indigenous children. More than 150,000 Indigenous children, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, were taken from their homes and forced to attend Indian residential schools across Canada for more than 100 years. In order to move forward with truth and reconciliation, we must first relearn and acknowledge our Canadian history. Understanding the historical context of colonization in Canada is an important first step. This timeline illustrates government-imposed law that paved the road to cultural genocide of Indigenous peoples in our country. European states claimed lands around the world by right of discovery and declared Indigenous peoples living there to be subject to colonizing power. The Royal Proclamation of 1763 laid down the basis for how colonial administration would interact with First Nations peoples in the centuries that followed. Further policies were passed in the first half of the 19th century that aimed to assimilate First Nations peoples into the growing settler population. 1831 saw the opening of the first church-run residential school in Brantford, Ontario. The Mohawk Institute became the first school in Canada's residential school system. The 1850 Act was one of the first pieces of legislation that determined criteria for a person to be considered a legal Indian, the precursor to the government's concept of status Indian. The acts commonly known as the Gradual Civilization Act of 1857 and the Gradual Enfranchisement Act of 1869 were primarily aimed at removing any special distinction or rights of First Nations peoples in order to assimilate them into the larger settler population. In 1867, the Constitution Act assigned legislative jurisdiction to Parliament of Indians and lands reserved for the Indians. In 1876, the Indian Act is passed by Parliament and aimed to eradicate First Nations culture in favor of assimilation into Euro-Canadian society. It forbade First Nations peoples and communities from expressing their identities through governance and culture. Additionally, in 1876, the Gradual Civilization Act became part of the Indian Act and gave the government sweeping powers with regards to First Nations identity, political structures, governance, cultural practices, and education. The Act also reinforced status Indians to voluntarily give up status and treaty rights in order to have voting rights. The Act also made it illegal for First Nations peoples to practice religious ceremonies and various cultural gatherings. Further, status Indian women were barred from voting in band council elections. Yet another eradication of important Indigenous culture and ceremony where women were once central to the community's welfare. The Indian Act heavily favored male power and disempowered traditional Indigenous matriarchies, which exposed Indigenous women to extreme violence. An ongoing legacy of this disempowerment and exposure is seen with the modern epidemic of murdered and missing Indigenous women. In 1907, after visiting 35 residential schools, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce, Chief Medical Officer for Canada's Department of the Interior and Indian Affairs, reveals that Indigenous children are dying at alarming rates, with the mortality rate of enrolled students as high as 25%. This number climbs to 69% after students leave school. He submitted a report critical of the health conditions in residential schools and blamed the federal government for negligence that led to the high death rates. He offered recommendations for improving the conditions in the schools. However, these recommendations were dismissed by Duncan Campbell Scott, who was the head of Indian Affairs at the time. In 1920, Duncan Campbell Scott made attendance at residential schools mandatory for every First Nations child between the ages of 7 and 16. The policy was also inconsistently applied to Métis and Inuit children. By 1930, more than 80 residential institutions are in operation across Canada. 1951 brought about a significant change in process, where the Government of Canada broke with tradition and through a joint committee process consulted with First Nations communities for the very first time ever regarding changes to the Indian Act. The amendments of 1951 removed some of the most offensive political, cultural, and religious restrictions on First Nations peoples. 1958 saw the introduction of the Canadian Bill of Rights. However, it did not provide First Nations peoples with full access to human rights protection, due in part to Section 67 of the Canadian Human Rights Act, which stated that nothing in this act affects any provisions of the Indian Act, perpetuating discrimination and inequality of Indigenous peoples. In 1985, Bill C-31 was yet another amendment to the Indian Act, removing all remaining enfranchisement clauses which reinstated status to those who had lost Indian status through marriage. In 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper delivered the Statement of Apology on behalf of Canadians for the Indian residential school system. Additionally, in 2008, 20 years after the last residential school is closed in Canada, and as part of the Residential School Settlement Agreement, the important work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission begins. Despite its various amendments, the Indian Act still discriminated against women and their descendants with regards to status rights. In 2011, Parliament passed the Gender Equity in Indian Registration Act, also known as Bill C-3. In 2012, the Idle No More movement raised awareness of Indigenous issues stemming from the legacy of the residential school system. In 2015, the Truth and Reconciliation Report was published and included 94 calls to action. So what is the Truth and Reconciliation Report? The report was issued in June 2015 as a testament to the courage of each and every residential school survivor and family member who shared their story. The purpose of the report was to redress the legacy of residential schools and advance the process of Canadian reconciliation. The report clearly identifies 5 areas of focus: child welfare, education, language and culture, health, and justice. The proposed actions call on all levels of government to work together to repair the harm caused by residential schools and begin the process of reconciliation. The Truth and Reconciliation Report calls on the corporate sector in Canada to adopt reconciliation framework that includes meaningful and respectful dialogue with Indigenous peoples regarding economic development projects, ensuring that Indigenous communities gain long-term sustainable benefits from these economic development projects, including equitable access to jobs, training, and education, and providing education for management and staff on the history of Indigenous peoples, including the history and legacy of residential schools. So, how can we get involved in reconciliation? In the words of Senator Murray Sinclair, you're already involved whether you like it or not. Reconciliation is not an audience sport, it's a participant sport, and you are already engaged. How are you engaged, and how do you want to change your engagement? That's the real question. How can we help? Again, Murray Sinclair offers this way forward. Read the Truth and Reconciliation Report. Read the 94 calls to action and figure out which one of those you can do something about, and then do something, because people who can should. Should you wish to review the content provided in this presentation in more detail, the links are available here. Additionally, there are a number of cinematic experiences that tell the story of Canada's history. Children of God and Indian Horse are 2 such examples. Should you require support in debriefing this information, we have professionals available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to assist you through our Employee and Family Assistance Provider. This completes your online learning content. We hope you have enjoyed your learning journey.